Okay, good morning. We'll start because we've got enough people to get going. I'm gonna have to do this with the visual because I can't figure out any way. Normally I do this with obviously a whiteboard or something like that. I am about to mess around with to pull up SketchUp to do this because I forgot about it till just a minute ago. Can you guys sort of see this little sort of sketch thing that I've got here? Oh, wait, hang on a second. Let me do this. I should be a little larger now. I was trying to explain a wet field system, and it's just not something that works over well verbally. So let me use this so when you guys can see this. Here we've got a stream coming down here, flowing downhill. Here we've got a set of fields. This is a classic Lo'i system. Now, what you have to do, and what you have to remember in the Hawaiian system is that when you're looking at Hawaiian use of the real estate, your technology specifically in like water control is really, really limited. All you've got is the rocks, the dirt, and everything that the environment's got anyways. And streams, of course, are incredibly aggressive, especially at cutting through sidewalls, especially here in Hawaii since they tend to flood a lot. So you can't build field systems assuming that the stream's going to be where it is now in a couple of weeks. Especially if, for example, you go and you dig a hole in the side of the stream to take a drainage ditch out, because the next time the stream floods, it's going to rocket down that hole and blow that hole out and make a new stream bed. So you've got all these sort of technological issues, which mean that you have to work within the constraints that you have technologically, but also within the constraints of Mother Nature. So as I think I mentioned last time, if you notice this red dot here, what you do is you intentionally during a very dry period, you actually block off the stream for a short period of time. You have it all set in advance. And so what you do is you actually go and then embed huge boulders in the base of the stream. And then you actually put paving on the side of it. So basically you've got a smooth stream bed with this paving in place. So now what you've got in the middle of the stream bed is this big boulder sticking up, or maybe a set of boulders. As I mentioned last time, this makes white water. So what's happening right here at the red rock, as the stream's coming down here, it hits that and the water turbates, which means the water pressure is a lot lower right below it. So right below that, you know, this little green line, basically that's what we call an Hawai'i. So the Hawaiians first embed the boulders, then they dig a ditch through the side of the stream to take water out of the stream. And they can do this because they've got the boulder in place already. So it's a very sequential thing. You have to do step one to do step two. If you just go and dig this hole in the side of the wall and put the Hawaiian, as I mentioned, next time it rains, boom, you've lost the whole thing. So it requires an enormous amount of knowledge of how water flows in subtropical environments, stream wall stability, on the amount of water that flows in the stream, and all that will be in a very calculated to figure out where you're going to embed these. So now that you've got this water coming, now you've built a series of flat-walled terraces or ponds that you've got working downhill here. Now, again, one of the sophisticated parts of this, which you actually don't see much today, a lot of the guys today actually use pipes, but traditionally, obviously, they didn't have pipes, but also they wouldn't want to use pipes because the water comes in here. So it's fairly cool. So you want to warm it up because if the water is too cold, the dalo won't grow. So you've got to warm this up. What you do is you make part of the walls here porous. So you intentionally don't stack them very tight so water can leak through. So what happens is water leaks from this terrace down to this terrace, from this terrace down to this terrace. Now, by virtue of the way you stacked, you know exactly how quick that water is going to leak through. So again, it's a very sophisticated, it looks very simple, it looks like you either screwed up or Mother Nature just did it right, but it's not. It's a very, very sophisticated system. You then do the same thing down here, so water leaks through to these. Now that does several things. One is because the water's leaking through, it's moving from here down. So you get the moving water you want. By virtue of the way you've meshed it, you don't have water coming out of a hose. You have water seeping through, so it's not going to tear around and damage your terraces. So no matter how much rain flows, you're always going to get the same amount of water. So you've actually controlled your water flow in the same way that you might use something like a faucet, but you've done this just by virtue of manipulating rocks. What this means now is you've got, we'll say, 3 terraces here. The problem you get into here is because this is exposed to the sun. Every minute the water's sitting here, it's getting hotter. So by the time the water gets down to this guy, it's actually really hot. At that point, it's very marginal whether the water's going to be actually too hot for the plants to grow. So what you do is you dig in a Y and you actually drain the water out. So the water's going like this. It comes in here, works its way slowly down here, and then works its way back out. And notice how you've done the same thing, where you've dug a hole in the side of the stream here. Just above, you've put a rock to, again, lower the water pressure in the stream. Now, because you've got this next series of terraces, you dig another OI here, and you run into your next series. So these guys would go all the way down here. So you've got this very sophisticated system of water rotation going in and out. This also means the nutrients move in and out. So a Hawaiian wet field system is a very, very complicated, very sophisticated system. And we know this because back in the 60s and 70s, when some guys were first starting to redo the fields, they would just dig, clean out some OIs, put some pipes in, then have the water shoot, and the plants were dying. They couldn't grow them. They didn't realize that this is actually part of a very complicated system. It's not as simple as it looks. So it's one of the problems you get into when you look at traditional agriculture, is because it doesn't involve modern machinery, fertilizers, and stuff like that. There's oftentimes sort of an assumption that it's simple, and it's really not. It's actually really complicated. It's just a different type of technology. I'll scan this in and send it out to you guys. So that's sort of this whole issue of wet field systems and how they work. Very, very sophisticated, very complicated, and yet in its own way either seems sort of simple. Okay, let's see. Okay, the next one of these is what I'm going to skip over is the dryland we've sort of gone through. I don't see any, I'll go into a little bit more on that later, but what I want to look at is actually a third of these. And these are something Hawaii was probably almost the most famous for, and these are the fish ponds. Let's go back to this one. So when you look at Hawaiian fish ponds, these were found on the leeward side of islands. They were intentionally manufactured. None of these are natural. These are all enormously complex, very, very, large in some cases, and oftentimes linked to other fish pond patterns. One of the problems we get into is, with the exception of 2, there's none actually in use today. So it's very hard for us. And again, in the 19th and 20th century, the fish ponds disappear as a food system by the 1840s, 1850s. They didn't require a huge amount of maintenance, but they did, just like the Loei systems, they required constant maintenance. So you didn't need to have like 100 people working on them, but you had to have 2 or 3 people working on them, 5 or 6 days a week. By the 1840s, 1850s, you couldn't get the population to do the work. They had other things they were busy with. And on top of that, the population had shrunk enough that you really didn't have the demands for a large amount of protein. Because what you get here, these are basically herbivorous fish, like the moi. So there just wasn't enough demand to keep them in production. If you had a fish pond, you couldn't sell enough fish to make it worth your while. So the fish ponds drop and disappear. In the 19th and 20th century, what happens, you can see with this one here, is they start to fill in because they're actually designed to sort of sometimes take silt in. And then what happened, of course, is especially in the 20th century, people loved to live on the beach and stuff like that. So these fish ponds became filled in and became land. A large amount of Kaneohe Bay, for example, is actually fish ponds that have been filled in. So a lot of folks in Kaneohe are living actually on a fish pond, literally on top of it. So this was the fish pond system. And again, weirdly enough, it wasn't until the late 1960s, early 1970s that an archaeologist out at UC Kauai, University of Hawaii, Kauai Community College, actually started to look at these in terms of just exactly what they were and how sophisticated they were. that it started to really dawn on everyone what these things were. So like the wet field systems, the fact that they were around, I think sort of led people to the idea that they fit a Western thing. Of course, the Western stereotype would be like a pen. So the Western stereotype of a fish pond was that this was just a fence that was put up and you just threw fish in the middle and just left them there till you needed them. It was like an aquarium, I guess. And it wasn't until Kikuchi started to do his work in the 70s, 60s, and 70s that they started to realize just exactly what these things are. Let's see if we can actually show it here. Okay, here's a modern one. I have no idea where this is. It's almost like some like Hilo. Anyways, so what you have here is there's really sort of three parts to this. One obviously is the fish, but actually the most important part is what you see down here at the bottom. Fish ponds work because Hawaiians realized when they were looking at the world around them. Let's see if I can get a better picture. That when you looked at the ocean, you found that brackish water and saltwater fish, especially your herbivorous ones, would congregate at certain locations, and they would congregate at locations where the water was shallow. It had rocks like these. It had water-worn rocks with sand in between them. And what happened is if those water-worn rocks and sand were at a certain depth and the water didn't move particularly fast, is you got algal bloom. So as the algae would bloom, the fish would come in and eat that. So it's sort of like grass. So the fish were basically grazing on a pasture, except in this case, the pasture was in the water. And so what happened is the Hawaiians over time realized or came to the conclusion they can actually mimic that. So rather than just waiting and finding spots where the fish congregated naturally, it dawned on them what you can actually do is you can actually make this situation happen. So rather than waiting for Mother Nature to do it, you could actually go ahead and artificially create the same situation. Here you see a classic fish pond wall. It looks like Molokai. In fact, I think I know this pond. And so what you do is you build a wall here. The water inside has to be about 1 meter to 1.3 meters deep. So if it's deeper spots, you actually fill it in with rocks. So when you look on the inside of fish ponds, those aren't natural. Those are entirely artificial. The fish pond has been artificially modified to be a particular depth. So here you see a fish pond. This probably took, maybe a couple of hundred people, maybe a couple of months to do this. And trust me, having worked on it before, fish ponds are absolutely brutal back-breaking labor. So you go and you actually make this smooth, if there's a word, you make it level. You bring in enough sand to basically level it off. These have to be built where you have springs. There's a spring right here, it looks like, and there's a spring obviously here. And the reason is the algae blooms the best in brackish water. So if you were just to build it out here in the salt water, your algae won't bloom. You have to have fresh water coming in to mix with the salt water and make it sort of, 60-40. And so what they've done is you build the fish ponds around the springs. So you need relatively level surface, you need fresh water, and then what you do is you find those two and you build as large as you can an enclosure to basically take advantage of that. Then you go and modify this whole thing to make it as flat as possible. So that's sort of the stage two of it. You have to take these two conditions, the fresh water coming in and the conditions in terms of the reef that you modify or the beach area that you modify. Now, one of the side effects of this is one of the reasons why you can't really operate a lot of the fish ponds today, even on Molokai, but certainly on Oahu. The freshwater springs have all been damaged. They're all tapped by wells further back. So most of the freshwater springs in Oahu don't actually leak into the ocean anymore. Even on Molokai, about 80% of the springs aren't active anymore because they've been drilled upslope and the water's been removed there. So if you don't have the fresh water coming in, you could build the most beautiful modern fish pond you want. It's not going to work because the algae's not going to bloom. If you don't have the algae, the fish can't survive because there's nothing to eat. So the very clever thing about this, like the wet field systems, but even more so, is the Hawaiians realized that if you set up the conditions that Mother Nature already had, but you artificially create and expand the same system, you take a system that is occurring naturally, a biotic system that's occurring naturally, and you're just replicating it again and again and again to take advantage of that. Now, to maximize that, what you do, oops, I lost the whole thing here. I gotta say that. To maximize that, what you do is you even more improve the conditions to make them as maximally successful as possible. You take those walls that you built. So inside here, you can see the water here. Okay, this is a classic fish pond. It's sort of silty. If you walk around in this, there's actually brown-green algae in here. And of course, out here, you've got the ocean. What you do is you put gates, or what we call makaha, in parts of the wall. I don't know if this shows up or not. Here's your fish pond wall. Here's the shore. You've got a spring or two back in here. The water's coming in. So here's your optimal conditions you've built. You go and you put a gate up here, and you put in a gate down here. Now, the ocean flow is moving this way. So what happens is the ocean comes this way, water comes in here. So we'll say that this is this one here. The water comes flowing in the ocean, comes in through the makaha into here. Now, like the wet field system, the algae in here requires moving water. It can't be totally still, or else it'll stagnate and everything will die. So you need slow moving water. So what you have is slow moving water come here, it works its way through the fish pond, and then it pushes out down here as a vacuum by virtue of the water flow, pulls the water out. So it's a very slow moving sort of eddy of water moving through the fish pond that is all the same level depth. In fact, you can see the depth is the same all through here. Now, what you do with the makaha is actually part of the really clever part of this. This makaha is set up to do one particular thing. Now, water's going through it, but what else is that makaha doing? To make this a fish pond, what do you have to have? You've already got the algae, you got the water. What's the third ingredient?
Fish.
Fish. You need to have fish. Now, what you do is you could either sit there and spend an enormous amount of time with a throw net catching fish and hauling their ass in here, which is going to be incredibly difficult to do. You're going to lose most of the fish because you'll stress them and kill them when you catch them. So what you do instead is you put this grate. Now, this grate looks like it's fairly solid, but actually it isn't. Small fish fry, generally a fry about this large, can work right through that. So what you're going to have is the fish, are born out here. Some of them come through here and realize here's these absolutely fantastic, best possible conditions. They come in here and they get real fat and happy and they grow. Once that happens, what's the problem the fish has once it gets fat and happy? What can't it do? Within a couple of days, it'll be 4 times larger than it was when it came through that gate. So I'm a fish and I'm hanging around here. I'm now all fat and happy. What happens when I try to leave?
They're trapped.
Yeah, they're trapped. This is like a mesh. It's a one-way door. It lets the fish in, but once they get in here, they can't get out. So fish are constantly coming in here because you got predators trying to eat them, whatever it is. They all see the season escape, come here, and they're all now happy campers, and now they're stuck in here. And because you've got the other end that drains it out, you've got the constant recycling. So once you've built this, in other words, once you spent the enormous amount of time and effort to build a fish pond, it's self-producing. If you've done it right, the algae continues to grow. The makaha still lets fish in and then traps them inside. So all Lucy has to do is whenever she's hungry, she just walks out here with a net, or even just walks out here and grabs the fish. They got nowhere to go. They're totally trapped. She doesn't have to worry about replenishing it because Mother Nature will because of the way she's designed this, Mother Nature's going to replenish it for her. So this is sort of like an automatic feeding system. It's like an automatic pasture system. You use what the natural conditions provide, use the natural species that occur in here. So you're not importing anything at all. And you just modify the conditions to provide optimal conditions in the fish pond that you've got. And so this is how a fish pond works. It's incredibly simple, at least when you sort of look at it. But on the other hand, it's actually incredibly complicated. Let's see if I can, there's not a really good picture here. So here's a typical fish pond. This is one of the ones that come along. I think we did some work on this one. So what you've got here is in this fish pond, you've actually got this system set up. Now, because it's an automatic system and because it works so effectively, you actually have an enormous amount of protein being generated in here. You have to remember that the rest of the Hawaiian protein sources were pretty much going to be pig, which was rare. Pigs were very expensive because they eat people food. You have the Polynesian dog, which again eats people food. You have the chickens, which don't eat people food, but there's not a lot of meat on them. So for most Hawaiians, especially by the 15, 16, 1700s, fish, in the sense of these herbivorous fish, cotton fish ponds, were the major protein source. They had almost everything else is starches. So in the Hawaiian system, these protein sources become incredibly important. And so what you find is that for many of the islands, the leeward side of the islands didn't have, you can see right here, this is not going to have a lot of agriculture. This all would have been dryland forest. So you don't have a lot up here that's going to generate food for people. But you've got this enormously productive fish pond that's literally generating, you know, probably a couple of tons of fish a day. And it's constantly reproducing itself. You don't have this replenishing itself. You don't have to do anything except make sure you keep the makahas strong and keep the walls intact. And the rest of it, and keep the water clean. So you go through every once in a while and make sure the water doesn't get too shallow and there's not too much dirt. So there are a huge amount of rules or kapu in terms of people doing anything back here in the back part because you don't want to pollute this. And of course you have to make sure that the springs let the water in. But as long as you provide those conditions that you built into this thing, then it'll just happily make food for you till the cows come home. Now the fish ponds are unique to Hawaii. Nowhere else in the Pacific do you see fish ponds like ours. In Kiribati, they have catch ponds on some of the reefs, but they're not production systems like this. In the rest of Polynesia, it's very likely you could have these, but it's very likely that it just didn't have enough. There wasn't enough population pressure to require this amount of effort, because these things are really hard to make, and they take a term. Like I said, they don't. In fact, here's a good image. If you can imagine, a lot of these things go for maybe half a kilometer. So every couple of months you have to go, and everyone in a hukidao situation, everyone would come out here and rebuild the walls and reinforce the walls and make sure the walls are intact, and also clean the water in here in terms of making sure everything's at the optimal levels. And so this requires an enormous amount of collective effort. It only takes maybe a couple of days, but it's a lot of really backbreaking, brutal labor. But when it's done, you would have this enormous repository of protein that would be available for the population. So fish ponds are the most unique, well, dryland ag a little bit. Fish ponds are probably the most spectacular, unique agriculture or aquacultural system in Hawaii. None of the fish ponds are actually fully active today. It's one of the ironies that we import basically 95% of our food source. They've been trying to get 3 of the fish ponds started up, but ironically we end up with coastal zone management and what are supposedly environmental laws that actually keep you from bringing something back that actually is already there in the environment. The best fish ponds are actually the ones in Pearl Harbor, remarkably Pearl Locks. We can't use those, even though 2 of them would actually be functional, because Pearl Harbor is so polluted that it's actually one of the 10 Superfund sites. It's got such an enormous level of metals and all sorts of other stuff dumped in there, largely by the Navy, that the water's toxic. So if you grew fish in there, you couldn't eat them. You might be able to mine them, but you couldn't eat them. And of course, on the rest of the islands, the problem you've got, as I mentioned earlier, is we've lost the fresh water coming in. So even if you were to rebuild this wall like these folks are, you don't have the conditions inside to actually replicate the algae growth that's going to make it effective for the fish. So we basically screwed up this environment so bad that even if we needed to reproduce this, we couldn't in the 21st century. So when people talk about bringing back fish ponds, that ain't happening. Theoretically, you could in a couple of the spots in Molokai if you shut down some of the wells and diverted the water and stuff like that. But here on Oahu, you can't do it. You might be able to rebuild the walls. They've been rebuilding one of the ones in Kaneohe side for the last, 15 years. But the problem is you can't replicate the conditions to make it a viable production system. So it's not that this is incredibly difficult to do, but it's incredibly difficult to do if your sense of attitude and values about how you deal with stuff changes. And this is probably one of the really important things to remember about the Hawaiian system, which wasn't unique, but it was real typical of their system. Is you can either, when you're dealing with things like aquaculture, agriculture, whatever it is, you can either look at the world that was given to you by the natural world, and you can figure out, okay, how can we optimize conditions? And it's very possible, for example, here, there's obviously a spring here, you can see by the trees. It's very likely that fish used to just hang around here anyways. But the genius to actually think, we can modify that and make a big thing that'll do this even more. So you work within the constraints of Mother Nature, the constraints of water, the constraints of fresh water, the mixing of the two, the constraints of the algae needs. And you basically modify and maximize that to get a very effective yield because you're actually working within natural conditions. You're not requiring a huge import of other things. You're optimizing existing environmental constraints. The other way to do this would be the classic situation now. And of course, the goofy thing is at the same time we have no fish ponds. If you go offshore of all the islands, especially Oahu, there's huge steel cages offshore where we raise fish. So if you buy mahi-mahi or something like that, that's actually, and salmon, for example, off the US mainland, those fish are actually raised in boxes. They're raised in huge steel cages. So in the modern system, what you do is you go make a steel box. You go and float it out in the ocean. You then make sure that you have to provide food for the fish in it for a period of time. And then what you do is you then harvest those fish. So, you know, it's almost, you could get to the point now, in fact, you look at some ads, some places that are selling salmon will point out that what they have is free range salmon versus domesticated or harvested salmon. Harvested salmon is a polite way for saying they all grew up in a box. So this is very much what I would consider the Western system. You use technology to bypass constraints. It can be the steel boxes you raise fish in. It can be a greenhouse that you use instead of the environmental conditions of what the say, land temperature is here. That can be these fertilizers. So it's two different ways you can deal with things like food production. You can either figure out how to maximize within the constraints you've got, which the fish pond would probably be the poster child of that. Or you can just say, well, screw this. My technology allows me to just do whatever I want to in this environment, irregardless of what the environmental constraints are. So it actually becomes sort of a competition to prove my technologies and I am more clever than the world that sort of Mother Nature gave you. And this is sort of the classic paradox. We've lived in the world of technology. And the problem with the world of technology, it's a very one-way world. It doesn't allow you to go back to this world. This world could add technology, but technology is a one-way street. And so when you look at this, oftentimes the most important part is that with technology, you can't reproduce this, except at enormous cost. Without technology, but paying attention to traditional conditions, you can reproduce this at relatively small cost. And the amazing part about that is it's self-producing. In fact, here, if you notice, these guys are gonna have to do, this is the backbreaking part. They're gonna have to take all this stuff out because of the goats and stuff upslope and the lack of controls. Silt and dirt have washed in here and basically ruined this entire fish pond. So once you've got this wall rebuilt, now you're gonna have to spend literally weeks, and I know I've done this. It's backbreaking labor. You have to sit there with buckets and scoops in your hands. You then have to take all this dirt here and dump it outside. When you've got that done, then here's one makaha here, then you're gonna have a fish pond again. Till the next time it rains, and because you don't have these upper slopes protected, you're gonna end up with more dirt here and the whole problem starts all over again. Because you don't have the conditions you had back 150, 200 years ago, which allowed this to be functional. So fish ponds are in many ways a metaphor for the world we've made for ourselves. And it's a choice that we make. And it's not that this was primitive. It was just a different way of looking at how you achieve a goal, which is basically food production. Okay. So all pretty straightforward. I deal with this stuff normally, so to me it's like sort of obvious, but okay. The last one of these I want to mention in terms of the food production has to do with the dry field systems. And again, this is the same thing that I was just mentioning. It has to do with this whole idea of technology, or it seems to me, you know, you can think of technology in two ways. Technology can either be tech in the way we see it, say an Apple iPhone or something like that. But technology, of course, when you really define it, is knowledge. The knowledge of what conditions are, how to maximize the conditions, how to take advantage of those conditions. So let's segue into this. I guess this picture pops up here. And what's sort of grim about a lot of this stuff is not so much the lack of knowledge of traditional systems, it's the fact that no one even cared to study them. So we're back on my part of East Maui. And here, this is at about 300 meters, so about 1,200 foot elevation. And from the period of the about 1820, 1830 into the 1970s, people were very aware, especially in the early 19th century, you have grazing animals, first, as we'll see spectacularly on the Big Island, then moving out to the other islands. And these grazing animals, just as I think I mentioned before, just destroy your dry forest environment because they'll eat anything the dry forest has in it. And by the time they're done, there's nothing left. So in that, people were complaining. The commoners, the Maka'anana, were complaining by the 1820s, 1830s, that the conditions were getting a lot hotter at lower elevations. There was a lot less rain, and they didn't understand why. But basically, they're having a really hard time as farmers because they couldn't grow their crops because the conditions, the environment had changed around them. And they were blaming it on the grazing animals, but they weren't really too sure of the interrelationship. And the missionaries that come in the late 1820s, 1830s record this because they're trying to set up missions with these populations, and literally these populations were having to leave because they're starving to death in areas that maybe 20 or 40 years earlier provided huge amounts of food. So the missionaries had no better idea what was going on, but they were actually recording this in their journals, sent back to the headquarters. Half of our population in such and such a place left because it's been so dry this year. It's been really dry the last 5 years. They're blaming it on especially the goats and the sheep, but they're not sure what it is. And when we look at it, we don't know either. What they didn't realize, and of course, then what you get is by the 1850s, 1860s, everyone's got this recorded in the sense that, oh, this happened. And some people were occasionally asking why, because it wasn't like now. It wasn't like you had global climate change. It just all of a sudden the local conditions changed. And it wasn't until a guy named Juvic over at Hilo, a geographer, was looking at this in the 1970s. He was actually trying to figure out why on the Lanai city side of the island, actually had fairly significant tree growth. But if you actually have a water catchment measures, the classic rain gauges, the rain gauges didn't show enough water for the trees that you had. In other words, the vegetation didn't make any sense. It wasn't getting irrigation. It was only getting natural conditions, but there wasn't enough rainfall coming down for those trees to survive. They should be dead. So he came to the conclusion that they were getting water some other way. And like if you go across the Pali this morning, he realized that what you had on Lanai Island, when you get about 500-foot elevation, is every morning the mist comes in. I assume probably one day he sort of had like one of those moments when he was standing in that stuff. And if you ever go up to the Pali when the mist is up there, very quickly you see droplets of the water start to form on your hair. Your skin will start to get wet from the moisture up there because you're in a cloud. And of course, clouds are nothing but droplets of moisture. And so what he realized is this moisture there was moisture, just wasn't in the form of water droplets, the same as in the sense of rain, but there was still moisture. So he set up these very clever screens that basically would catch the mist and then measure how much was coming down. And what he found was for the upper elevations in Lanai is there was only about 30 inches of rain, but there was almost 20 to 25 inches of mist coming down. So on a yearly basis, what you actually had was an area that looked like it had 30 inches of rain, but for the vegetation, it was more like 55 to 60 inches of rain. It was just part of it was droplets, part of it was mist that was then collecting. And what you find with a lot of the Hawaiian vegetation, you can see these here. Oh, here's a really good example, and I mentioned the vili, is the trees grow up in such a way that if you visualize this like a hand, this he has basically got its hand out. So the mist is coming from here, the mist is coming downhill. So as the wind pushes the mist, it hits that tree. Ohia, like a lot of the other trees, has very slick leaves. So it hits that, and the water that collects on that, beads on that, is going to drain down. Now notice how it's the way this is shaped. The water's going to drain down here, drain down the trunk, and come down here. Now this particular section of Oahe only gets about 20 inches of rain. But as far as we can tell, it gets about 25 inches of mist. So this Ohia is actually a pretty happy camper because it's actually getting the amount of rain, the amount of water it needs. But that's not largely coming down as rainfall, it's coming down as mist. Now, what they suddenly realized when he started to look at that is if you go and have something hit this forest, if, for example, like your grazing animals in the Big Island, if they go and they eat back the vili and destroy the dry trees that are up here, then what happens is these trees aren't here. Not only do they not catch the mist, but by virtue of not catching it and not bringing the water down and also not being there, the ground temperature increases. As the ground temperature increases, that means that it radiates heat, because you have to remember the Hawaiian landscape is a combination of red dirt and black. So it's very, very prone to pushing heat. Again, if you think of like this today, I'm sure If you go walk out on any of the pavements out here, you're just going to see the heat radiating off of that asphalt. So what you get here is this can be very hot if the sun hits it. But traditionally, if the mist was here, the sun wouldn't hit it till about 10 o'clock in the morning, and you've got a fair amount of it that would get shade from the trees, and the trees are also providing a ground cover here, which shades the land. If the herbivorous, if basically your herbivores come in here, eat the grasses, eat the low stuff, destroy the trees, then all of a sudden now what you've got is bare vegetation. So it's the equivalent of an asphalt pavement. And at that point, the temperature raises, the heat comes up, and what happens is the heat rises, the mist doesn't come downhill. So when you look at this, in a weird way, this part of Oahe has mist because of what happens upslope. Let's see here. Oops, did it wrong, sorry. So you can see back up in the back here, you've got mist coming down. This area here is sort of marginal, but what actually happened is unintentionally for other reasons, folks in Kanaio Town, which is back here, started growing eucalyptus trees about 40 years ago. These were actually more as a wind protection. At that point in time, there was no mist coming down this mountain. It used to, but that mist quit coming down in the 1840s, 1850s when this became a cattle ranch and all that vegetation disappeared. So that the community back up on the other side of this bump started planting trees for other reasons. But one of the side effects of planting the trees was, as they planted the trees, the temperature started to drop. As the temperature started to drop upslope, then the mist started to come back down because the area was cooler. And so what happened is areas like this are here because upslope somewhere, there's now trees again. So the tree cover actually pulls the mist down slope. Now, as we see when we get to the Big Island, if you go to Waikoloa, for example, that area used to get mist down to about a 300-foot elevation. When the herbivores came in and wiped that out, the mist is now receded almost to Waimea Town. So what you get is the average land temperature has gone up probably about 3 to 7 degrees on a daily basis. There's no mist coming down, so now you end up with a situation that you've got no rainfall and you've got real problems. And of course, you see this. Oh, wait, this isn't showing. Okay, this is what happens after the herbivores are there. Especially on Kauai and on Maui, it's your stupid goats, but this is also a cattle ranch. So right now the mist level's up here. So you can see the trees in the background, and that's a good couple of clicks upslope. The mist used to come all the way down to here. When the herbivores ate all the trees and ate the vegetation, you can just sort of visualize how hot this environment is now. There's nothing protecting this ground from the sun. And so what happens is the sun comes in, it radiates, it hits off here, the heat rises, and that pushes heat up, which acts as a fence. So if you can see, the clouds are just bouncing over this. They're not bringing mist down. The clouds aren't coming down slope to provide moisture here. So Ulapalakua Ranch, along with the other ranches on Maui right now, is in the middle of an absolutely stunningly severe drought. It's been going on for roughly 15 years off and on. It's not going to change. Even if they get rains, it's temporary. But the irony is what they need to do is if they were to plant large numbers of trees, even in rows, that will help to reduce the land temperature, at which point then the mist come down and you don't need rain, because rain is never how this place survived. This place survived because of mist, like you see up here. So what you've got is the modern conditions are you have to either import water. So for example, you bring water and you pump it in down the pipeline and you put it in troughs for the cows. Well, that's fine, but that doesn't do anything for what the cows are supposed to eat. So you basically, in the system we've got now, ironically, you want to make money off of plant grazing animals, but the conditions you set up make that impossible. You're going to have to change the conditions of the real estate to make it viable. And so what you find ironically is most of the ranches now pasture most of their animals up here because it's more green. And they've pretty much given up on these lower stretches because it's too dry, but ironically, it's their situation that made that happen. And in the modern system with technology, we can't fix this, though we made it happen to a certain extent. So even your dryland forest, your dryland system, this was actually very successful on the other side of the road. I think I showed you the picture before. This was actually part of a very successful village that existed till probably 1830, 1840. So this used to have clumps of trees, and there was all, sweet potato planted down here, and there are people living all over the place. Grazing animals come in, eat, destroy the trees, eat the vegetation, and the temperature shoots up. This has got to be at least 6 to 8 degrees warmer than it was 200 years ago in this landscape. And that's just, again, not paying attention to the conditions, but it says something that we didn't realize that till the 1970s, 1980s, that we totally ignored the evidence of the 200 years prior. So there's not enough work that's being done on both the traditional landscapes and also the landscapes that Hawaiians used at the time of Western contact. Because if you're talking about sustainability, you're not going to do it with technology. Technology is not sustainable. Technology by its very definition is anti-sustainable. You have to find ways to deal with what you've got. And this one, ironically, is as simple as planting trees. It's about as low, it's about as uncomplicated as you can possibly imagine. Okay, so that's our agricultural systems. Let me pull the next one here. Hang on, I have to fish this sucker up. You have to remember, basically, the Hawaiians were able to keep that system working perfectly fine until the early 19th century. And one of the problems you get into in the modern discussion or contemporary discussion is this all, for some reason, gets blamed on two people. Cook on one hand, which there's some legitimacy to, and then the missionaries on the other, which doesn't really make a hell of a lot of sense. So when you're looking at these things, let me clear this out here. It's important to remember that the Hawaiian system had a set of constraints. One of the biggest constraints, if you have a wet field system or you got a fish pond or you got dryland agriculture, is you can have a really large population. The Hawaiian Islands population in the 1700s was really, really dense. The Kalani Pu and then his kid Kamehameha are able to mobilize a military force of 30 to 50,000 guys to invade Maui. Now, if you think about it, that's 30 to 50,000 folks that are not raising food, they're not doing anything. Kalani Pu, his dad actually had 2 regiments of warriors that did nothing from childhood but trained to fight. So they were never farmers, they were never fishermen. You needed to have a large population, one, to provide those people, just to have them. Secondly, you need a large population that's going to grow the food and provide the other services to keep those guys in that. Militaries are luxuries. Militaries require that you've got a surplus food, a surplus this and that you can actually afford to have people doing these things. In the Hawaiian system, you had 2 surpluses. One was the specialist, like the military. The other, of course, is the chiefs themselves, which are a significant part of the population. So your chiefs, and by that I mean not only the Ri'i, but also your kahunas, basically your entire system of management, both religious and political, were not folks who did any work. They were what would now be called bureaucrats. Other people, the Makainana, fed them. The other folks provided them with food and clothes and everything else they needed, so they could be managers. And so in that system, what you have is you have this large population that's dependent upon this very, very large, sort of the peasant population, the Makainana under them. And that's your Hawaiian system. Now that works, but there's several part of tricks to it. One of the tricks is it only works, ironically, as long as food is perishable. So if you're a chief and it's like 1750 and you want to show you're somebody special, there's actually a pretty limited number of ways you can do that. You can't really do it through consumerism because there's nothing that you have that no one else can have. Yeah, you can get a feather cloak made out of very rare birds' feathers and stuff like that, but it's not really, there's not that many of them and it's not that big of a deal. You can only eat the food as it shows up because the food rots quickly. So you can't go and order everyone to give you like 10 tons of sweet potatoes because they're only going to last a couple of weeks. So what you find is the chiefs had power. The chiefs could control the population, but the chiefs were still very much within a system of sort of shared consumption, shared governance. When the Europeans show up, not so much Cook is, of course, the first part of this, but more importantly, the traders that follow him. And this is a group that gets very little play because it's important to remember that Cook was a huge shock to the Hawaiians because they existed in a very insular world that largely was Hawaiians. And of course, they understood that they had, they occasionally would have folks coming up from the south, again, Pa'au, for example. So they understood there were other Polynesians out there, but they didn't understand there was a, whole world of totally different folks out there until Cook shows up. So Cook shows up and all of a sudden now it's sort of like a new ball game. In that, the traders that follow him were interested in Hawaii because Hawaii was a place where you'd get food resources, rebuild your ships between, on one hand, originally collecting furs in the Pacific Northwest, like otter and stuff like that. Stopping here in Hawaii to fix the ships up since the Pacific Northwest was a pretty bad place. And then sailing off to China, which is where you would trade the furs. You'd then take the tea and the silks and stuff that you got from that, come back oftentimes to Hawaii, refix the ship, and then sail around South America back to where you came from, which was either Europe like London, or say somewhere like Boston, or somewhere like somewhere in Rhode Island or Maine or something like that. So Hawaii was sort of like a giant gas stop. So Hawaiian was the gas station in the middle of the desert. Everyone stopped there because it was a long trip in every other direction. You needed to fix up before you made the next long part of the voyage. And so what happens is after the British discover Hawaii and put it on the map, everyone who wants to make a few bucks, and there was a ton of money to be made in this China, North America trade, gets involved in this whole mess. And that becomes how the system works. Now in that, what happens is then is these folks are in the business of making money. And so what they're going to do is they're going to come to Hawaii from somewhere else, England, the United States, wherever, and they're going to try to trade with the chiefs because they need the food and the resources the chiefs have. And so what happens with this is this drives consumerism. So the chiefs very quickly get used to the idea that there's a whole mess of neat crap they didn't know about before. And it very quickly, in their view, becomes a way to show their power by acquiring these new things that the Europeans provide. So this becomes part one. Part two, and again, I think I mentioned this before, but just to reiterate, you have to remember if you're a chief in the 1700s in the islands, and this, again, read Kamakau if you want to see this, you had one criteria: you had to be successful. If you're a chief and you're not successful, since all the chiefs were in competition with all the other chiefs, if Anthony's not successful, another chief's going to come, they're going to whack him, break his arms and his legs, take him to a heiau and sacrifice him. So the chiefs that are standing, when you're looking at Kalaniʻaupuʻu or Kahekili or Kamehameha himself, you're looking at the boys who are standing on a pile of bodies of their dead competition. It's sort of like the Survivor show, but no one's ever coming back for a second season because the survivor has killed everyone who was on the show, which might not be a loss when you think about it. So in that situation, any chiefs that are standing in 1778 when Cook arrives are there because they have gotten rid of anyone who was their competition. The closest parallel I always draw, though it seems sort of weird, is if you look at the high chiefs in the islands, they were the equivalent of large mafiosi don in, say, the US mainland in the 21st century. There used to be a bunch of TV shows on the mafia guys, the mafia leaders. And it's very much the same thing. If you're a high chief and you show any weakness, well, wham. And that's why Kamehameha takes Oahu, because the Oahu high chief shows a little bit of weakness. He ends up with a revolt, can't deal with it. Kamehameha maxes his warriors out that he'd just taken Maui with, sails them on Oahu and kicks the guy's ass. Very opportunistically is doing that simply because he can. And the Oahu guy ends up dead on his heiau. So what you get is a situation where your chiefs were all competitive players because the non-competitive ones were dead. Now, in that situation, you have to remember that these folks are very, very smart. They're very survival and me-first oriented. So when the Europeans show up, when Cook or someone lands somewhere and a chief's interacting with them, they're not going to fall on their knees and think, wow, this is really neat. Look at all the neat stuff they have. These folks are going to look at this and sort of think, okay, I see two things here. One, what can I make out of it? What can I get out of the situation? So for example, when Kalaniʻaupuʻu meets Cook on the Big Island, that's exactly what he's thinking. Okay, yeah, this guy might think he's a god, or I might, some of my guys might say he's a god. But I need to know two things. One, what does he have that I can use? 2, what does he have that I've got to make sure none of my competitors get hold of? So all the high chiefs very quickly monopolized the Europeans. They immediately started grabbing around the shoulders and say, hey, nice to meet you. Come on, hang out at my place. We'll have a few beers and watch some football or something like that. Now, they may sound like they're being friendly, but in reality, you want to make sure is if the guy's sitting around in your yard watching football with you, he ain't doing a deal with someone else. So the European Americans, the traders who are coming in, have this weird relationship with the chiefs. The chiefs want to monopolize it. They want their stuff, but they also want to make sure no one else talks to them. The traders, of course, are trying to maximize the amount of money and goods and resources they can make so they can go somewhere else and make a ton of money. So what all this does is this drives what becomes the monarchy. The monarchy is a result of these two sort of forces. They weren't there for the same reasons. They had very different agendas. But the end result is they figured out how to work together because they both got something out of it. But the minute it changed, then all bets were off. So Kalaniʻaupū decides that Cook is not quite what he thought he was. He kills him. The high chief on the west part of Maui decides that an American trader is screwing him over, which he is. So he goes and takes the other guy's ship and massacres all the crew. It's called the Fair American Incident. So this was a weird situation that chiefs were in charge. They would tolerate the situation, but if it didn't work to their advantage, they'd erase it. Then another guy would come in and this would all start over again. So, and you have to remember, the missionaries don't show up till the 1820s, long after this has been going on for a way period of time. The first traders show up by 1795. By 1800, there's 20 or 30 different ships coming in every year trading, and there's a couple of hundred Europeans, Americans living in the Hawaiian Islands, working for various chiefs, doing stuff, doing trade and stuff like that. So we had become a very cosmopolitan place by, say, 1810. And this is why Kamehameha becomes successful. He's the best at figuring out how to use this new world, this new set of relationships, and that makes him the, quote, king of the Hawaiian Islands by virtue of being the best at figuring out how to do this. In other words, he won the competition. He was the stand-up winner of the Survivor Show. And all the other guys are now little footnotes in ruling chiefs, and we know where their bodies were, either buried or whether they were executed by someone like Kamehameha. So the monarchy is a reflection of this very complicated system of relationships where these surpluses in the Hawaiian landscape became under really direct control of chiefs to basically run the new world that was showing up. But the chiefs were very opportunistic, very success-oriented, and as we'll see, became very me or I-oriented in contrast to the traditional system. Because if you were too me-oriented, you ended up dead. Kamehameha gets to power by killing his half-brother. That's not exactly a close family relationship. And he kills a bunch of his other relatives. So, the role of the chiefs in the early 1800s is not oftentimes the way it's presented today. It's a very complicated, very hard world. It's very much like that Game of Thrones show. And then he was the one that won the show. Okay, so with that, we'll stop and get into this more next time. Does it all sort of make sense? I'm not sure whether you guys look more depressed on Monday or Friday. Well, not depressed, just sort of zoned out. So, okay, are we all good to go then? Okay. So I'll see you guys on Wednesday.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.